So dramatic. All right, we'll just go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the last of our virtual Pub Talk series. The topic for today is Wildlands and Recreation with Bobby Whittaker, Tiana Luke, and Tim Coleman. And a little bit of background noise. I'm just going to mute everyone. All right, and then 2 weeks ago we had forest restoration, and last week we had managing for wildfire resilience. Those, the recordings will be up on our website soon, so you can check those out. And I'm Gina Clays. I just joined NEWFC this year, and I am the outreach coordinator and facilitator. And if you want to put where you're calling from in the chat, that would be great, so we can kind of find out where our audience is coming from. And yeah, so NEWFC is the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition, and it's a collection of different stakeholders that work to help manage the Colville National Forest here in Northeast Washington. And so maybe we can move to the next slide here. And we wanted to put on these pub talks to educate and inform the public about issues that affect the Colville National Forest, and hopefully to increase interest in those issues. And so recreation on public lands. That's a very important topic. Many stakeholders are invested in this. We have all different kinds of user groups that use the Colville National Forest. And it takes time and coordination to come up with a good strategy. So it takes into account all the many different perspectives that are involved. Next slide to introduce our presenters. So we have Tiana Luke. She is a board member for NEWFC. She is the Colville Forest lead for Conservation Northwest, and her past experiences as a botanist, forester, and GIS specialist for a consulting company and BLM. We have Bobby Whittaker, who is a board member and the recreation liaison for NEWFC. And he's the president of Ferry County Rail Trail Partners and has organized events including Get Out Fest in Republic in 2019, and is a member of the Republic Skate Park Committee. And he has past experience including over 30 years in the music industry. And we have Tim Coleman, who is a board member and secretary and was one of the founding members of NEWFC. And he has been active in forest and water resource conservation since 1971. He's the director of the Kettle Range Conservation Group and also co-founded the Columbia Highlands Initiative and Wild Washington campaign, and is a US Navy veteran. So thank you to all our presenters, and we can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Well, based on the chat, it looks like most people are pretty local to the area and familiar with the Colville National Forest, but just in case there's somebody on the call that isn't, I wanted to get everybody oriented for where the Colville National Forest is. The Colville National Forest is 1.5 million acres. To the south of this map, if you can see my cursor here, is Colville. This different color right here is the Tonasket Ranger District, which was added to the Colville National Forest just in the last couple of years, making it to go from 1.1 million acres to 1.5 million acres. And a quick land acknowledgement. The Colville National Forest is the ancestral homelands of the Colville Confederated Tribes and the Kalispel Tribes. NEWFC's mission is to collaborate with government and public interest to steward and conserve forest ecosystems in Northeast Washington so plants, animals, and our communities can thrive. So a little bit about the history of the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition. Back in the 80s and 90s, what was going on was known as the Timber Wars. And during that time, the forestry of the time was doing a lot of detrimental impacts to the environment. There was old growth logging, there was clear cutting, there were all these things that were really detrimental. And so the environmentalists came in and they started suing. And because of that, the timber towns in those areas were really hurt. So people were losing their jobs, timber mills were cutting down, and really nobody was getting what they wanted. So around the end of that, what came out of that was collaboration. So in May 2002, local environmental groups, along with a lumber mill called Vaughan Brothers Lumber, came together and decided that nobody was getting what they wanted. And so Kettle Range Conservation Group and the Lands Council and Vaughan Brothers Lumber met and said, look, we need to find a solution to these things. And out of that, NEWFC was formed. It was a product of the Timber Wars. During that time, after a little bit went by, there was this founding agreement called NEWFC's Blueprint. And the blueprint was also known as NEWFC's Third Agreement. One component of that was active management, which was assurances for the timber industry in order to get timber harvest off the forest. Another component was restoration zone, which was a zone that did lighter management on the forest. And then wilderness. So this was really a foundational agreement between these parties that both environmental groups were agreeing to do active management on the forest, and the fact that the timber industry was agreeing to have wilderness on the forest. And this really represents a balanced approach. Tim and Bobby? Anything to add? You're muted, Tim.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the
There you are. There you are.
wilderness or wildlands part of the agreement. And, essentially what the agreement was all about was balance. Okay, so it was like a lot of the history of conflict was around the loss of wildlands and old growth forest. And so what we wanted to do was to find a way to support timber industry jobs, protect our communities from wildfire, but most importantly, protect wildlands. And wildlands can mean many things, okay? But generally speaking, we consider wildlands to be areas where roads are not there on the landscape, where areas are larger than 1,000 acres, on up to the largest wildlands that we have left on the Colville National Forest. Well, actually, now that with the Tonasca District, we actually have part of the Pasayten Wilderness. And of course, we have the Salmo Priest Wilderness too. Those are the two largest wildland areas in the Colville National Forest, but only a portion of the Pasayten, a small portion. And so, generally speaking, wildlands are places where nature exists on nature's own terms. In other words, the systems that we are familiar with when we hike the Kettle Crest or the Selkirks or the Cascades in those wild areas that we love to visit so much, that's nature evolving and evolving over time. It's not that humans didn't have an impact on it. Of course, humans are part of wildlands too. And the term wilderness was really coined only to reference areas that would receive special management designation. But in no way did it imply that humans were never part of the landscape. We are a natural species, and wilderness has always been a place where humans love to go and relax and find solitude. And of course, most importantly, from my perspective as a conservationist, wildlands are critical habitat for endangered species such as lynx and grizzly bear, super important to the clean waters that feed our salmon populations and trout and those salmonid species and other sculpins and other non-trout species. It's like, and of course amphibians. So wildlands run the gamut of habitat for a variety of species, from bees and butterflies up to moose and grizzly bears and other bear species. So it's like the one thing that we know is that wildlands have been shrinking like a snowbank in the summer sun. And that is because of human population encroachment and development. And so it's like, it's not to shame humans, okay? It's not to say we're bad. It's just to recognize that we have an obligation to future generations to protect habitat, secure habitat for species who don't vote, who can't complain about it. They just either die, wink out, go go extinct, or they have to move on to higher ground. I mean, like, for instance, the pika that lives in the kettle range of Selkirks, it can only tolerate cool temperatures. That's why it lives very high up in the mountains, and it needs shaded environments. It needs rocky structures. So, I mean, there's just a whole myriad of species. And so that need natural areas. So, of course, the threats to wildlands are development, be they human communities, be they roads, be they logging. Okay, it's like logging is appropriate at a certain scale. And this, again, is from my conservation perspective as a member of the Forest Coalition. It's like it's appropriate at a certain scale, but it's not appropriate at all scales. In fact, it's not even economically viable at all scales. So, I mean, I think the threats to that roads bring are invasive species, even and weed species included. They bring poaching, they bring sediment to streams, they increase the risk of wildfire. There's a whole host of reasons that roads are damaging to wildlands. Yet at the same time, we humans would like to drive our vehicles to where we can access wildlands, right? So, I mean, I think that's part of the balance of NEWFC, is finding out where we can protect those wildlands and even reconnect them. It's something that we talk about in the Forest Coalition. We haven't gained a lot of traction yet with the U.S. Forest Service on it, but we're working on that. And the other thing I would say here before I sort of pass the baton here to Bobby is that, this issue of wildfire, it just keeps coming up and coming up, like, oh, the wildfire, the reason we have this wildfire risk is because we have too many trees out in the landscape. It's like, this is a natural forest. I mean, if you look at the Kettle Crest where there's been big wildfires, in particular, like the White Mountain Fire that burned across the Kettle Crest, or even which was 1988, or the Dollar Mountain Fire in 1929, which burned from approximately the Colville Reservation boundary all the way to Boulder Pass in the Kettle River Range. Look at those forests. Those came back naturally, and they're naturally thick. And they come back, and you have what's called a stem exclusion phase, where the trees naturally thin themselves out. And during this whole process, there's all of this ecological activity that goes on in the forest, creating soils, creating habitat for invertebrates like ants that are so critical to the health of the forest and critical to so many species of wildlife. Like right now, the birds, they're collecting ants like crazy, feeding their babies. The next generation, okay, wildlands provide that. Dead trees are essential to soil creation. Dead trees, snag forests are essential to woodpecker species. There's 6 times more life in a dead tree than there is in a green tree. And so I just sum up that, you look at our art, you look at art, and you look at where people want to go. I don't care whether they're walking or riding an ATV. They want to go to a beautiful place of beautiful scenery, and that's wildlands. I mean, some people want Christmas tree farms out there on our national forest, but naturally appearing landscapes have a certain natural appeal, and it goes way back in our history as human beings. And so, one thing about wildlands is they provide awesome recreation. So I want to turn it over to Bobby now to talk about that.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you, Tiana and Gina. I wanted to walk it back just a second. I know, let's see, I got introduced. You casually mentioned I worked in the music business for 30 years, and that's kind of embarrassing. But I do want to say, when you talk about, first of all, I love public lands. I come from a public land family. My mother and father were big outdoor recreation folks. I was always out on the recreating with my family. My father went on to be on the board of the State Parks Advisory Board and the National Parks Advisory Board. So I spent a lot of time in those parks and on public lands. So it's a passion of mine. And my career took me into the music business, but I would always come back and I would always return to public lands. I couldn't afford waterfront. I couldn't afford a gigantic forest, but you can when you have, that's what you have in your public lands. And that's where the recreation comes in. The Colville National Forest, Northeast Washington, the Colville National Forest It's a very beautiful, subtle place. A friend of mine used to say it's like Montana and Idaho, but without all the people. And so I fell in love with it out here. And the Colville National Forest, I think in particular, it really has it all. And I really, from a recreation standpoint, I'd like to augment that. But when you talking briefly again about the collaboration, I just think it's very rock and roll to me. Like, I don't tour with rock and roll anymore. I don't work in rock and roll anymore, but I work with this collaboration, and to me, it's very progressive and very cool. When you talk about a timber war, where Curtis Vaughan says they were down to 5 or 10% of their logs coming off the national forest, this collaboration, the Northeast Washington Forestry collaboration, changed all that. And now they're up to 45% or something coming off the Colville National Forest. That's very exciting. It's win-win scenarios that excite me. And I feel like that's what this collaboration embodies. And that's what we're all working towards. It's pretty exciting. And I'm the dorky recreation advocate for that. Working with these, I'm very flattered to be a part of this group now and hear about these ants and trees and stuff like that. But I am a recreation guy at heart, and that's where my passion lies. I'm not going to babble too much. Tiana has sort of a flow. I'm not sure how this PowerPoint's going to work. So Tiana, do you have any cues for us, or do you want to keep rolling through this?
Well, we'll keep rolling. We can head into some of those more details on recreation, wildlands
Perfect.
a little bit later.
Perfect.
But you did a great transition when talking about accomplishments. One of those accomplishments was how Vaughan Brothers Lumber went from like 10% of wood from the Colville National Forest to over 40 now in the last 20 years or so. And along with that, you know, the Colville National Forest in 2020 had over 122 million board feet harvested from the Colville National Forest, the most. That's a ton, right? The Northeast Washington Forest Coalition has collaborated on over 40 projects. And along with those 40 projects, we've secured agreements among NEWFC members on proper restoration actions. You know, we're still working to cement those in our workings with the Forest Service, but among these parties, we've made great leaps and bounds as far as what restoration looks like on the forest. And we have done a lot of great things. Bobby will talk about more about this later, but we've secured retained receipts for recreation. I believe it was almost $450,000 in the last year or so. But unfortunately, you know, NEWFC has that thirds agreement, or, you know, Wildlands was an important component of that. So far, we've had 0 permanent protection for wildlands on the Colville National Forest beyond what we already had before NEWFC started. So we still have a little ways to go. And I do want to acknowledge that while we have like made a bunch of leaps and bounds and we have accomplished a lot of things, that collaboration isn't always fun, and it isn't always, you know, kumbaya, hold hands, or, you know, get together for a couple of beers afterwards. It can be, the progress can be painfully slow, and really collaboration is, yeah, I see Bobby reaching for his beer over there. It's necessary sometimes. No, terrible coping mechanism, but like collaboration is hard and it's difficult. And what keeps everybody coming back to the table is the love of the forest and the shared interest in realizing that everybody wants to sustain the forest for the future. That's the goal here. That's why the parties are at the table. That's why everybody's working hard, despite, you know, not having a major component of NEWFC agreements having been accomplished yet. And I just want to show a map here of all of the wildlands on the Colville National Forest. This map doesn't have great contrast, but all of those pink lands there are primarily unroaded areas, including inventoried wilderness areas or other backcountry or wildlands on the Colville National Forest that have not been permanently protected. And those wildlands are an important component of NEWFC agreements. So even though we've spent about 20 years with NEWFC's blueprint and we made a lot of progress with this thirds agreement, based on some recent science and recent social agreements and stuff like that, we realized that NEWFC really needed to update their blueprint, and we're calling that NEWFC strategic vision. And as of today, we have a final draft for that. So I'm gonna celebrate. Woohoo! I'm really excited about that and a little bit sleep deprived, But NEWFC's strategic vision has, 4 different objectives, and that is to demonstrate abundance and opportunities for all. It's to demonstrate a science-based but socially influenced approach to ecosystem management. That socially influenced approach is an incredibly important component of collaboration. We know that conservation and ecosystem management isn't just about the science. It isn't just about the policy. That social component, that human component is incredibly important. And it's also to streamline the collaborative process, right? So if we have these collaborative agreements, so even though we have a map, we also have these agreements, these principles. I talked about, the agreements among parties within NEWFC that helped demonstrate our agreements for ecosystem management on the Colville National Forest. So if we have these agreements ahead of time, what we can do is we can have these preemptively so we can streamline some of the process down the road when we're working with the Forest Service on projects. And then of course, create a balanced approach to ecosystem management. And now that we have NEWFC's strategic vision and we've once again cemented NEWFC's agreements on having wilderness and wildland protections along with ecosystem restoration on the forest, we've identified that with the lack of wildlands being permanently protected, there is a need for legislation in Northeast Washington. And part of that need is so we can support a thriving economy, enhance outdoor recreation, acknowledge cultural heritage, and protect those public lands, including wildlands. What do you have to add, Bobby and Tim?
I guess I'll speak for a second here. That's great, Tiana. I appreciate that. I want to mention 2 things. You talked briefly about retained receipts. So when you talk about these timber sales, people may not realize what that is. I just want to say specifically, we're trying to talk about win-win-win scenarios. So when the timber sale happens on the Colville National Forest, a certain percentage of the money stays with this forest, and it has to go to is it aquatic restoration or road restoration associated a lot of the time associated with timber sale. Go ahead.
Ecosystem restoration in general for the most part.
Right.
It could be like
so
road decommissioning, or it could be fields treatments or prescribed burning. I mean,
right. And it's only perfect. It's only been until the last few years that, well, for starters, we have set the record for board feet coming out of this forest couple years running, or if not the record, damn close to it for the entire United States. And by doing that, we've accrued a lot of retained receipts. So we have a lot of retained receipts in the bank because of the work NEWFC's doing with the Forest Service and working on these projects, keeping the logs going to the timber mills. So we have a backlog of retained receipts. So one thing I've been doing inside NEWFC, and NEWFC has been helping with, is to advocate for those retained receipts to be spent on recreation, which didn't used to be the case. It's pretty exciting. Last year in particular, one of the things I'll mention is the Pacific Northwest Trail Association, which is one of the partners who help keep the trails open, received $220,000 to work on the Pacific Northwest Trail, which is also part of the Kettle Crest Trail. That's incredibly exciting. And I was talking to my friend in the Backcountry Horseman, and he's like, how the heck are you guys doing this? Why can't we get, this is for the Colville specifically. And he was frustrated that they can't get other national forests to spend this much in retained receipts on their recreational trails. There's a Beatty Bold project that received a lot of money as well. That was a motorized project. So all recreation users benefit from these timber sales, which is pretty exciting to me. That's a real aha moment. And then I want to mention also the partners that help keep the forests open and advocate for their individual recreation experience. There's so many partners that work with the Forest Service. It's pretty incredible. You've got, in no particular order, the Republic Tree Benders, which is a snowmobile group, Selkirk Trailblazers, Tri-County Motorized Association, Washington Trail Association, Backcountry Horsemen of Washington, Pacific Northwest Trail Association, just to name a few. Northeast Washington Trailblazers out of Colville. I mean, the list goes on and on. Everyone's coming to the party to make these trails and recreation pop here. and it's exciting to have these retained receipts help in that respect. I also want to say, real briefly, when you talk about legislation, the Forest Service worked on their forest plan for, I don't know, 500 years or something like that. And they, that was a joke. And they find 20 years, 15 years. And they finally hatched this forest plan. Well, it's got all these different designations for forestry, active forestry, backcountry, wilderness. And I see those as recreation designations because I'm a rec dork. And there's a need for those to be made permanent. And the way to do that is through legislation. The forest plan is one thing, and we want to take it to the next step so we can really keep humming here and everyone can double down on their specific recreation and keep working, and everyone can have a premium experience, no matter what your user group is or what your recreation of choice is. I wear many hats. I'm an off-road motorcycle enthusiast. I like to float rivers. I like to backcountry ski. I like to hike. So I like it all. And it's important to have these designations so every recreation user group gets a premium experience. I think I'm talking too much because we don't have a ton of time, but we can talk about some of this stuff when we open it up for questions.
Let me add in, Bobby.
Go ahead, Tim.
So in terms of getting back to the legislative issue, I mean, this has been on the front burner on and off since the mid 1970s. And, you know, thank goodness that we got the Salmo Priest Wilderness, and Tom Foley is to be, you know, he's the one who made that happen. And it's a difficult road. You know, I've had this question asked to me numerous times, often in a sort of an adversarial way, which is how much is enough? It's like, well, how much of the landscape gets developed before you realize how the little bits you have left that you saw on that map that Tiana put up on the screen? How much is enough that, you know, you provide for wildlife, that you provide for future generations, that you provide for clean water, that you provide for scenic backdrops to our rural communities that makes this place so special? It takes guts to pass legislation. And it's like there's you know, we have as a coalition created fertile ground for making that happen because we've debated it in public. It's gone through the forest planning process, and we know from that 15-year process that the Forest Service will not solve the problem. Okay, it's like maybe it's incapable of it, or maybe it's just too much pressure being applied to them, you know, for them to make really decisions that are based on the needs of future generations. And it's like, you know, to suggest that somehow this is the purview of a county commission that may be in office for 4 years or 8 years, it's like it's so much bigger than that. We're talking about generational issues, about those kids that are just graduating from high school, that their kids will be able to inherit this beautiful landscape. And I've been around a lot. I'm a mountaineer, I'm a tele skier, and I've been doing it for a long time. And the Kettle Range and the Selkirks are really special places. Okay, that scene right there from the Kettle Range is like, you go over in the Passaic, you will not see that. It's different. Okay, it's a different ecology, different ecosystem. I mean, yeah, those white bark pine and so on, which the Kettle Crest has a lot of, as well as the Passaic in certain areas. But you know, the point of it all is protection in a legislative format sets the bar. People know what it means. You know, it's like it's a commitment, like you might say marriage is a commitment, where we are saying we're going to promise future generations that this place on the map, nature will be allowed to do what nature has always done, evolve and evolve. And through all of the beautiful cycles from fall until spring and summer, it's just like, it's not a huge lift. And we need somebody to take a leadership role. You know, we have done this through the forest coalitions. We learned how to become partners and support what the timber industry wanted. I mean, I'm a tree hugger, for crying out loud, you know, but what do I get? You know, what do all the people that we talked to and said, you got to believe in this collaborative process, are they to look at this and say, well, they didn't really mean it? What do you know? It was just a lie. Take me to the altar and walk away. You know, so I'm just saying it doesn't have to all be wilderness, but it can be national conservation area. It could be a national monument, but it needs to be legislated. It needs to be put in a place that says nature does have rights, okay? And free-willed nature says that all those myriad species that depend on wildlands will have a place that they can put their rest their head, as used to say in the Loomis campaign. You know, it's like from lynx to salamanders. That's why it's so important, and that's why the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition has hit the ball over the fence. Now, if we can just get the legislators to take that ball and run with it, and we'll be there for you, and we'll have a lot more years of success if that happens. And if it doesn't, because remember, the coalition came about because of conflicts over old growth logging and roadless area development. In other words, de facto unprotected wilderness being logged and roaded. And that'll happen again, I promise you. Okay, so let's not let that happen. Let's act proactively in this case. And you know, we did what we were asked to do as conservationists. We've been at this now for almost 19 years. Okay, if that isn't a sense of dedication, I don't know what is.
As Tim mentioned, this is something we've been, well, some people have been doing for over 20 years, and or even, you know, efforts to have permanent protection for wildlands have been around since the 70s. What makes this round different is because it can be more of a win-win-win for everybody in this scenario. I mean, it'd be a win-win before, but at the same time, like here, the hope is to bring in a whole bunch of different components and make sure that we're working with all parties on the ground, so everybody gets something out of this deal. You know, we have Indigenous acknowledgement, we have recreation gains, we have you know, forest health gains, etc., and that can all be legislated, and it can be a win-win scenario, and everybody can get something great out of it. Tim already covered a lot on wildlands back there a little bit. But prior to the Tenasket Ranger District being added to the Colville National Forest, there were over 220,000 acres of wildlands. Now there's more with the Tenasket Ranger District. So that includes those inventoried roadless areas, non-inventoried roadless areas, and backcountry areas. And without not including the Pasayten portion within the Tenasket Ranger District, there's only 3% wilderness on the Colville National Forest. That's the least in both Oregon and Washington. We want to change that. And as Tim mentioned, you know, these wildlands are irreplaceable. Unless they're protected, they do go away. And that's unfortunate. It's something that the coalition is aiming to prevent. My next slides are just pretty pictures of wildlands because, I mean, that's more fun than us talking at everybody here.
Finally, this is what the part I've been waiting for.
Yeah. Well, there's a few others in recreation, but this is a view from the Abercrombie Mountain Trail. Does anybody want to add anything about Abercrombie Hooknose as we go through these, Tim and Bobby? No.
I'm good. I just want to
Play.
take it in for a second.
Yeah. And profanity. I think this picture was on another slide.
If you like bear grass, you'll love it.
Yeah. Good point. This is from the top of Copper Butte. I think probably a couple more weeks before the flowers are as prime as they are in this photo, but it's coming shortly. So get out there here in mid-July or something. Looks like Pete has his hand up. We can take questions now.
Hi, thanks for the presentation, Tiana, Bobby, and Tim. One question I had, and I'll just preface it by I'm not a scientist or a hard scientist, right? So I don't proclaim to be, but I'm curious about one argument that I've heard in the past about wilderness and not wanting to transition some of these areas to wilderness is the with increasing fire risk and bark beetle, if there's concern or what the risk is to like locking some of these lands up in wilderness and then not having the ability to go actively manage if something happens. Can you speak a little bit to that point or that concern that folks have that, if we create a whole bunch of additional wilderness and then a catastrophic fire goes in, I mean, does it, you kind of lose that, but I'm just curious on your perspective on that.
Well, I'll answer that. Pete, if you look at the Kettle Crest, you'll see there's been 4 major fires, large fires, which you might call catastrophic. But we also know that the forest ecosystem recovers from fire, and in fact is very adapted to it. Not all lodgepole pine, Pinus contorta tree species have serotinous cones, but they do in the Kettle Range and in the Selkirks and in the Eastern Cascades, Northeastern Cascades, whereas they don't in the Southern, okay, because we have fire history here, and so the cones are glued together, they're buried in the duff, and they're waiting for the next fire. So they created early seral species. And of course, we've had those fires in the Kettle Crest. Did it destroy the forest? Well, I challenge you to go into White Mountain Fire, the 98 fire or 88 fire south of Sherman Pass, burned across the highway, but then went out when it snowed on it. Okay, but you look at that, there's heavy tree growth. There's a lush shrub layer. It's what nature has always done. And there's tons of examples of that. The Pasayten Rim Fire, and many others. Go in there and look at those fires and fire areas. And what you've got is a snag forest with an incredibly vibrant shrub forb grass layer underneath of it. And that layer is super important to wildlife. And in fact, some plant species like Ceanothus need fire to regenerate, or they just die out. So, and thirdly, or whatever I'm at here, is it really cost effective? Even if you took all the tree species off there, all you need is a wind, 40-mile-an-hour wind like stick pin fire. It'll burn anything that's available, given that it's hot and dry like it is right now. If we get a wind and we get a fire, it's going to spread rapidly, just like it has been. And in fact, many of the fires that we've had problems with this season have been grassland fires. They've been shrub steppe. And last year, 600,000 acres of Washington sagebrush country and grassland wheat fields burned. Okay, so it's not an issue of you're going to prevent fire by logging the trees off. It's not economical to log them off, and it's a natural part of the forest ecosystem. In fact, there's 6 times more life in a burned forest, in a snag forest, in a dead tree than there is in a live one. So that's what I would say. And I just say the proof's in the pudding. You see that tree right there that's dead with all the lichen growing on it? Well, that died in a fire. Okay, it died in the 29 fire. In the Dollar Mountain Fire. And now look at all the trees around. It burned off all kinds of areas, 180,000 acres or something burned in that fire. So
I want to add to that a little bit. There's a reason that a lot of these wildlands are eroded still and there hasn't been logging in them. That's partially because they're hard to access. So when Tim talked about it being, not economical to do so, there's that reason too. A lot of these are high elevation forests. So as we touched a little bit on in the presentation, 2 presentations ago on forest restoration, a lot of times these high elevation forests are actually have this long fire return interval, over 100 years. And because of that, these areas aren't actually outside of the historic range of variability. And so fires should burn characteristically in those areas still, which means they're going to burn hot. There are some fires, Tim referenced the stick pin fire, which is the larger fire than probably what naturally occurred in that area. But at the same time, they're they're not exactly forests that need to be restored at this point in time, right? This high elevation forest. Some of them might be. And another point is, we talked about there being over 220,000 acres of wildlands in the Colville National Forest. The new initiative to legislate some of these wildlands as wilderness or other designations. We aren't talking about doing all of those wildlands, right? We're talking about doing a select few that working within the community to find appropriate areas that work for everybody. It'll be some subset of that number. And some other areas, might end up being some sort of other designation, like a national conservation area or something like that, which might allow some flexibility to do some restoration if needed, non-commercial, of course. And no roads, of course.
Great, thanks a lot.
Maybe we can get to Ed's question now. He was asking if NEWFC had to do it over again, would you do it differently? Maybe an incremental harvest and wait for some wildlands protection, just since he mentioned that wildlands protection is lagging behind other aspects of the compromise.
Well, let me go first, since I'm a founding member. There's a lot of times when I say, what did I really achieve? Well, I met some nice people. I learned a lot about forest management that I didn't know before. I also learned how to tolerate disappointment upon disappointment. And, it's sort of like let no good deed go unpunished sort of approach. It's like, you can do all kinds of good things. And if you do one thing that they don't like file a lawsuit because you're concerned about roadless areas being logged or old growth trees being logged, then you're demonized. And so I think that, I just ask myself that again and again, and it's like I always come back to, I think it's important. I think that the communication, that collaboration provides is super important, and I think also that NEWFC agreements, which really are balanced, which really do allow for member organizations to challenge actions that are not highly supported by the group, gives it a degree of leverage and validity. So I mean, I apologize to those people who think it was just a waste of time, and I promise that I won't give up on as long as I can breathe to see these beautiful wild country protected. And lastly, I mentioned something about artwork. You want to see the coolest artwork, hike to this Snow Peak cabin and look at what fire did to those trees. I mean, it is so gorgeous. It's like the most unique artwork you've ever seen. The way trees are hollowed out, the figures that are made, and then of course the new green forest that came in after it. But yeah, I'm still here. I'm still with it. I'm still supporting it.
I guess I take a similar but slightly different approach to Tim when thinking about that. I mean, part of the agreements within NEWFC are to essentially support the blueprint, support the interest of others, like you would support your own within NEWFC. That's part of the foundation of collaboration, right? It's straight up unfortunate that we haven't achieved wildlands here, and sometimes the reasons why are outside of the forces within NEWFC. And that's why NEWFC continues to work for these things. So I have less experience in this than Tim does, only about 5 years with the Northeast Washington Forest Coalition. But I'm still very optimistic that we're going to accomplish everything that NEWFC has set out to do in the future. And because of that, I don't necessarily think that, doing it incrementally we couldn't do it. So I guess the question isn't whether or not we would have done that. It's, strictly how would we have done things differently. And I think there probably could have been efforts to push for wildlands and permanent protection of wildlands a little bit more in the past. But at the same time, we have accomplished a lot in forest restoration, not just like a lot of the work that has been done with forests due to NEWFC has been ecological forest restoration, right? Due to efforts between NEWFC and the Forest Service and other involved stakeholders on the ground, right? So we have accomplished a lot of good goals for conservation as well, beyond just wildlands, which we still need to work on. The second part of your question is, would that force other stakeholders put political pressure on the process for wildlands protection? I mean, potentially, right? There are, you know, I think questions were asked at one point in time, you know, it looks like the timber industry in this case is getting a lot of what they want. And that's true, they are. But I'm also seeing efforts from the timber industry within NEWFC to continually push for wildlands on the Colville National Forest. They haven't backed away and they haven't stepped down. And that's important. That was kind of a non-answer, but I think that's okay. We have a few more slides on recreation coming up. I mean, they're once again just woohoo, recreation. So I'm going to go through those because we only have about 15 minutes left, but I encourage anybody to jump in with questions as we go through this, since we do only have about 15 minutes left. Once again, these are just pretty pictures to prompt discussion of recreation. So I'm going to kind of throw it to you, Bobby. We have this one, and then we'll go into some more details on retained receipts and the surge in recreation.
That's a good picture of Tim killing a fish. I hope you took it to the vet, Tim. There's the picture on the right is a group that we went up just a few days. We went up on Monday, I think, and we did the Sherman Peak Loop, and that was pretty fun. That's a beautiful, beautiful hike. That's Tom Amend. He's a member of Evergreen East Mountain Bike, and he's also a member of NEWFC, which is the Northeast Washington Trailblazers. They do a lot of trail work, both for hiking and mountain biking. That's Tom Amend. North of Highway 20, that's Columbia Mountain Trail, which is just north of Highway 20 on the Kettle Crest.
I was on Columbia Mountain on Sunday, which is what this photo is from behind me. Fun fact.
Right. So this is Tom slightly below that fire lookout, which Tim, I think, did the roof on that fire lookout. Thank you, Tim.
Bobby, do you have anything else to add on retained receipts?
I don't really, but when you and Tim were talking about would you do anything differently, I think that I understand and I agree that there haven't been conservation gains, but I also think recreation was sort of an afterthought in the Colville National Forest for a long time, and in Northeast Washington in general. 20 years ago, when I first moved here and started working on the Ferry County Rail Trail, there was a lot of resistance to a trail. There was resistance to trail building. There was resistance to grants for trails and trailheads. That's changed. We have commissioners now that call me and ask me to get river access for floating. Commissioners that support skate parks and support recreation in general. Everyone recognizes recreation can be a driver for the economy now too. But it's important to make it planned, and it's spiking right now. People are moving to the Northeast Washington Territory or even Spokane in droves, and you're seeing that spike in our national forests at trailheads and campsites. Unfortunately, the Colville National Forest staff don't really track the numbers, but it's spiking, and that's another reason I feel a little bit panicked to get some legislation for permanent protections. So it's a time sensitive thing for me from a recreation standpoint. But I'm all, here I am, live by the sword, die by the sword. I'm advocating for recreation, but I want to do it smart and I want to do it right. And that comes through the planning process. And that's why I'm excited about Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition revising it's, you know, the first couple decades were hard fought, but that blueprint, that early blueprint that you guys are modifying was huge. It stopped the timber wars, but now I feel like what you've digested and what's coming out in the strategic vision or the updated blueprint is exciting to me. And I do feel like that is setting us up for a perfect opportunity for the community to get behind some legislation to protect these areas and create assurances for the timber industry too. And yeah, that's about it. All industries, I should have said, sorry. There's a lot of people that depend on this national forest.
I was wondering if there were some recreation projects that were in the works that you guys are excited about, maybe increased access to the Colville National Forest. Like, are there some specific ones that you have in mind that you're working towards?
That's so there's a process for that that's important. It's the public's land, and we have to do it right. We don't want to get out over our skis, so to speak. And I know I want to say there's a mountain bike area off Taylor Ridge that took a long time to sort of get the approval to work on. We have almost an embarrassment of riches in the ATV trails and access and mountain bikes and hiking. Right now, we're trying to just kind of keep everything open and create that access for everybody, keep the trails open. It's called log out every year. The trees fall across the trail every spring. Groups come together and open up the trails again. So people are constantly different groups advocating for their own trails. But right now, I don't have any specific project. There's all kinds of small projects, but nothing I can think of too substantial to focus on right now. I'm trying to get water access on the Kettle River. But you know, this is a long game, and you got to do it by the book with the Forest Service, because it's your land as much, it's your trail as much as it is mine, your forest as much as it is mine, and we gotta balance it out and do it right.
Can I ask a quick question about the recreation piece of things? Obviously, well, I recreate a lot on the National Forest. I live in Central Washington, so the Okanagan, Wenatchee is where I spend much of my time. And I mean, I think we've all seen it, especially the last year, 2 summers, last year and this year with COVID. Everybody's getting outside and trying to explore these areas a lot more. And so a lot of the infrastructure is getting really used. And have you seen, has there been any conflict or issues arise that you've heard of or know of in terms of between some of the mechanical or commercial treatments that are happening in recreational or just people out driving around on Forest Service roads? Are there any, have you seen or heard any conflicts arise between sort of recreational users and sort of the industrial mechanical commercial side of things?
That occurs. I want to, without getting too into detail, there's a project called the A to Z project, Mill Creek in Colville. That's a pretty cool project. There's a new one in Chihuahua. They're trying to actually do a much better job of involving recreation in these large landscape timber areas. There was a little bit of a screw up in the first one, the Mill Creek, the A to Z, the first A to Z. And I want to credit where credit's due. The Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition were big proponents of why that thing came to existence. But working with conservation and timber doesn't always mean the recreation's considered. So with the A to Zs, they're bringing more recreation voices in there. But we did have a trail crushed. It was a local neighborhood trail. It was not an official Forest Service trail. So we went out there with Vaughan, some folks from Vaughan, and did a tour with the with the Newts, the Northeast Washington Trailblazers, and got that trail repaired. That's just sort of an example where we're trying, and it sort of failed in that instance. And now we're trying even harder to do better. I'm always trying to do better. I like to try to make things better. So getting this forest running on all cylinders and getting recreation to be a part of that is, you got to advocate, and that's what we're doing here. But that's an example of they were trying to involve recreation. They did. The trail was flagged even, and it got crushed, and then they went back and repaired it. And so now we're trying to work with, get ahead of that and work and be more inclusive of recreation, so it's mutually beneficial. That's, to me, that's what Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition is aiming for. It's mutually beneficial and win-win scenarios. You know, in the 50s, it was a zero-sum game. I want to beat you, we need to win, I got to stop you, or whatever. I mean, that goes for conservation. Conservation didn't like recreation up in conservation areas. So all of a sudden inside NEWFC, you have a win-win scenario attitude where everyone's trying to be cognizant of what everyone else needs. And sorry, a little lengthy answer, but I hope that answers your question. Come on, someone throw a hard ball here.
Yeah, I'll just point out that we have our contact information on the screen right now. So if you want to reach any of us or all of us, we have our website, our Facebook, Instagram, and then our contact information over here. NEWFC does have just a regular email address too, which is newficinfo. I'll put that in the chat real quick.
Yeah, I would say please do go to NEWFC's Facebook and follow it. It's also on Instagram. Please do that, because we need the community to know the good work that these guys have been doing, working with the Forest Service and on behalf of the community. This is the public's forest. NEWFC is the public working on everyone's behalf. And so we want you guys to know the hard work that's going on, and we also need your help as we try to move forward and do better, and ask the Forest Service to do better. That's on all of us.
We got a question from Crystal. She's worked on these issues for years and loves the Colville National Forest. She wants to know how NEWFC is engaging the public in numbers large enough to achieve the goal.
Good question, Crystal.
Are you saying we should boost our Facebook
Chris.
posts or something?
Yeah.
Come on, Tiana. Yours.
I'm not the social media
Crystal's a
expert. I
veteran,
just happen to be like one of the few millennials on the NEWFC board. So I was the one who had to do social media. So
I think one way to engage people is definitely to have volunteer events and events such as this, just to bring the public in. And once people are invested in the land and working, out on the Colville National Forest, then they just naturally start to become invested in these issues. And so I think it's just a long-term effort of just engaging the community and getting people to be interested and care about the Colville National Forest.
A good friend of mine once said, we were talking about a used car. He was trying to sell this car or whatever. And he goes, the car is going to sell itself. It's a good car. The Colville National Forest is incredible. And I think that it sells itself when you get people out here. We did an event called Get Out Fest. The Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition worked with me and a bunch of local folks here at the Ferry County Fairgrounds, and worked with the Forest Service to get people out mountain biking, hiking, paddling. We ran a race on the Ferry County Rail Trail. That to me was a big outreach piece that we did. But there's going to be an ask at a certain point. We need support for legislation, and we need support to help do better and bring this thing in for a landing. And I feel like it's coming to that point where we're about to do some major asking of the community after the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition finished this revised blueprint, which is now called the strategic vision.
Yeah, I think it's definitely engaging with people on the ground, local business owners. That's the beauty of the new legislation that will hopefully be proposed in the future. Is a win-win scenario for everybody. So we can get parties that may not have been interested in this previously engaged. It's of course working with other organizations in the community, say Spokane Mountaineers or somebody else who is already interested in this sort of work, who has more of a following than NEWFC. And I also want to acknowledge that this was funded by a Washington DNR grant. And with that funding and hopefully other funding, we'll be able to do a little bit more outreach. And like Gina mentioned, she is our outreach assistant. So we're hopefully ramping up to do a little bit more of public facing work and also work with other organizations that have more of a public following to help us get the word out as well.
If I could put in a final word here, I would, one thing I would like to say in answer to Crystal's question and just the general concept of we have to go out and raise awareness. We've done this now for 45 years, okay? And it always comes down to having a legislator who has the wisdom and the temerity to do the work. And it's like one thing that's different now than in the past is we did all this up front, okay? You can't tell us that wilderness or conservation or any other legislation is somehow just a double trick. We're going to go back and on our word and we're not going to do what we promised. Well, we've already done that. Okay, we've already done the promise part. Okay, 19 years we've been doing this. So that doesn't hold water anymore, and that always was a big stumbling block. So I think hopefully we've moved past this, have to prove our love or our willingness to help and be collaborative. We've done it. And now it's time to move forward with legislation.
Yes, everyone, we need everyone to be a part of the movement at some point. And I think that everyone, we've gone over our 1 hour limit. Is that it? Gina, do you want to close it out here?
Yeah, we can, please get in touch if you have any other questions. And thank you so much for attending, everyone. If you provided your address when you registered, we'll be mailing you some swag, including stainless steel pint cups, stickers, and coasters. And also, I'm going to send out a thank you email to everyone who attended. And if you're interested in being added to an email list to find out about updates, then just reply to my email. And yeah, I think I'm going to stop recording now. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your afternoon.